Ever notice how growing up in a Christian home, you're always hearing about Christian principles? Like, I know my mom's over there, and she's a huge Christian principled person, and I love my mom, absolutely do. She's going to love me less a little bit after this message. But it was that way when I was growing up, that Scripture was kind of used to develop a Christian principle. But then after a while, because I was such a bad student or whatever it is, what hung around was the Christian principle. And Scripture was kind of one step removed. Yep. And after, pretty soon, I couldn't even tell what the actual Scripture was that was supporting that Christian principle. Now, I don't know how many of you relate to this, but I'm trying to be really honest. You know, as an Asian kid growing up in a godly home, this is what happened to me. And so I'm thinking if it happened to me, maybe it's happened to some of you. Yep. And so then all I could remember was the Christian principle that my mom told me. And then something else happened along the way. My mom and dad's principles, they were actually based on Christian principles that was based on Scripture. So I had my mom and dad's principles that were based on Christian principles that was based on Scripture, right? And then suddenly I became really focused on my mom and dad's principles because those were the principles that were being enforced in my house. So then it became that godly men would eat all of their food, that they would get home before midnight, that godly men would never borrow money to buy a depreciating capital asset like a car. Yeah. Why? Why would you do that? You know, and as I became older, I discovered the funniest thing. I discovered flaws in my parents' way. I found that things that worked well in Malaysia in the 70s and the 80s didn't necessarily work quite the same way in Australia in 2010. But because I never knew Scripture, and because I only knew these principles, some of them just kind of taken from one line of Scripture, as I kind of discarded some of my parents' principles, I thought maybe the Christian way was like that too. I thought that maybe these Christian principles, this Christian way of viewing the world was equally as dodgy as some of the advice I was getting. Not that my mom's advice is dodgy. It's actually 90% of it's really good. Like, do not invest and borrow in a depreciating capital asset. It's just not a good idea. Yep. Okay. We can talk about that later. It's the inner accountant in me. Okay. But you know what? I'm so glad I discovered that the Christian way is not my parents' way. In fact, my parents' principles are not God-breathed. Yeah, it's not, it's mum-breathed. You know, that's a different category altogether. Let me just tell you, that's a different category. Yeah, and as much as we'd like to make it exactly the same thing, I mean, I've got kids myself, and I know I want to make it the same thing. I do. Daddy says so, you know, it's as good as God-breathed. But it's actually not. And Scripture is in a different category. It is God-breathed.